newspaper industry has slowly declined around the country, Connecticut has been lucky to have so many outlets remain open and reporting daily. One important piece of that puzzle is the work that is done at the Connecticut Mirror, which provides the state with crucial, in-depth reporting on legislative, education, and health matters. Keith Phaneuf, the Mirror state budget reporter, joins us today to talk about the budget, upcoming elections, and how it all affects municipalities. We'd like to thank our premier sponsor, Digital Back Office, Palo Alto Networks. Check them out at digitalbackoffice.com or paloaltonetworks.com. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect consensus views of CCM or member municipal leaders.
Keith, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been in journalism now for over 3 decades, covering a lot of government finance as one of your primary areas. Why state budget, income tax equity? What drew you to those beats specifically? How do you kind of boil down such complex kind of topics for lay readers?
I don't know how interesting it's going to be. It was probably my second job. I graduated from UConn in the late 80s, and I worked for a paper in New London, and then I went to Manchester, and the managing editor of the Journal Inquirer, Chris Powell, was very, very focused on state finances, and it was a priority that he made for me, and he was very determined that we get out in front in that area. And then it just became a matter of the numbers always spoke to me. They just always made sense. And I realized how much of all of politics is driven by Connecticut's financial capacity. Yeah. And then, of course, I have to admit I get accused of being too negative, but I've always been kind of drawn to Connecticut's fiscal problems because they're sort of the magnet that's pulling our compass off course. Our longstanding debt, and we may get into that, is the answer to so many questions when people ask, well, why don't we have better roads, or why don't we have even better schools, or what's the problem with taxes? Yeah. There are so many answers behind it. So it's at the risk of over dramatizing it, it almost kind of becomes a little bit of fiscal archaeology.
Mm-hmm. Looking at the mistakes of the past, trying to figure out how we got to where we are at the moment. Exactly. Definitely. But with that sort of longevity in the business, obviously you started out in a print world. What do you think about the migration towards online newspapers? Why did you choose to move to the Mirror, kind of when this really starting out for a lot of?
Like you say, I started out in print. I spent about 22 years in what we'll call traditional print newspapers. Yeah. I went to the Mirror because it's one of the last opportunities to still do journalism in Connecticut. And my fear is that journalism as a whole, and I'm not even saying just print, journalism as a whole is, I won't say dying, I don't want to over dramatize it, but dramatically shrinking. Yeah. So many people say, well, it's just this exodus to the internet. I don't know that that's the case, because there are very few news entities that don't have a website. Almost every newspaper also is a website. Almost every radio station. I mean, the littlest AM station, 1,000-watt station, has got a website and a Facebook page and a Twitter account. To me, what's happening is we're going through a period where it's not people are saying, and particularly being 57, I'm going to show my oldness and my crankiness, my age here. Younger folks are simply not consuming news. It's not that they're abandoning traditional newspapers for Twitter or Facebook. They're abandoning newspapers, radio stations, online websites for non-consumption of news. That's what concerns me most of all, and I'm hoping it's just a cycle that will change.
So they interest more in something that's a bite-sized, memeable, so you can put a fun image on your page, but an in-depth, something you have to read. The TLDR, as they're fond of, too long didn't read sort of situation. Is that kind of what you're seeing happening?
Some people don't even want to bite.
Yeah.
I know that I'm going from skeptical to almost cynical here, but some folks don't even want to bite. And unfortunately, it's kind of like when you look back at the history of the press in the United States, you go through these cycles where news isn't consumed as much. And then you get, unfortunately, a burst of corruption, kind of like you did with Watergate. And all of a sudden you have this explosion of investigative journalism all over the nation. That is one of the trade-offs when people don't consume news is you get corruption.
Yeah. Speaking of kind of trade-offs with going digital, we've kind of lost some of the budget where, you can send Woodward Bernstein on for months on end to cover one big story and sort of that mindset. But the flip side is that the digital has in some ways opened up, deadlines are a little bit looser, word counts. Has any of that sort of flexibility helped you in what you do?
Again, I'm sorry if I'm staying on the cynical mode. It's mitigated the decline, but that's it. Because I hear what you're saying where you say, well, you have some more flexibility. But really what happens is, I'll give you an example. When I graduated from the University of Connecticut in 1988, the New London Day, which was my first job, the deadline for the newspaper was about 11:30 at night. And this is a pretty small paper. I mean, for that time, it had a circulation of about 50,000. You had, no matter when the story broke, basically, of course, your editors didn't want you goofing off all day, but you had until 11:30 at night if you needed it. And that was your one bite at the apple until the next day at 11:30 at night.
Yeah.
Now, because you have deadlines constantly, there's that pressure to get the story in right away before everyone else and then update it. So you're constantly on deadline. But the real problem is every news organization, it does not matter what kind, has largely shrunk.
Yeah.
There are no large organizations anymore. So instead of, for the most part, people having an organization where they can specialize, that's what's vanishing. It's not jack of all trades. It's really, you have reporters who are just getting a flavor of everything and not getting a chance to go in depth. And that is one place where I will boast a little about the Mirror. We still have some specialty beats where I have the relative freedom, for example, to focus largely on state finance and fiscal policy. Most other news organizations, and I mean print, radio, television, online, simply don't do that anymore. Their reporters have to do everything.
They're the photographer, they're the videographer, they're the
Exactly. And if you're trying to say, well, listen, I need you to do a story about how the state of Connecticut can use bond premiums to effectively borrow money to pay off borrowing. They just kind of get this quizzical look like, what are you talking about? They don't have the time to do the research to understand how the bond market works, how bond premiums can be used. And I particularly took something very wonky. I'm not trying to confuse everyone.
Yeah.
That's what's being lost in journalism. That's really too bad. But that's because of the shrinking of news consumption, the shrinking of revenues, and the shrinking of news gathering in terms of both reporting staff size and the average experience. They're both declining rapidly.
Yeah, when you have someone who's basically overworked and getting too much thrown at them, the temptation to take that press release kind of at face value and not do that in-depth back checking, I think would be very tempting, understandably, for people who are, doing three people's jobs at this point.
I think that's absolutely the case. And it's even in the realm of politics. Politics has adjusted to that. I've been covering gubernatorial campaigns since the early 1990s. And the last three campaigns, I've covered some of the boldest claims where politicians would promise things that just seemed way, way too good to be true, that I think, quite frankly, they would have never even attempted those pledges 20 and 30 years ago, because every editorial board in the state, no matter how liberal or how conservative, would have called them out and questioned their forthrightness. But now there's this awareness that journalism tends not to fact check as closely as it used to.
the math on whether or not you might get away with it has changed a little bit for some people.
And are you promising pie in the sky, or are you promising something that's actually empirically realistic?
Yeah. And now everyone's checking that pie situation anymore. So speaking of pie in the sky situations and people who are in fact doing the work, let's talk about the state budget a little bit.
Sure.
So right now in Connecticut, it seems like things are moving in the right direction. Rainy Day Fund is reaching its highest level in a long time. One of your articles, you said that even coronavirus-induced recession couldn't stop analysts from forecasting big surpluses for the next 2 years. Did something click? Does Malloy deserve some sort of credit for this? What got us to where we are at the moment?
What got us to where we are at the moment are two things. And both of them are very unstable. Mm-hmm. One is simply, and this is sort of a post-2009 phenomenon, post the Great Recession, and that is the stock market almost seems to be, I won't say it's entirely, but the appearance is almost as though the stock market has become disconnected from the rest of the economy. Mm. We had unprecedented unemployment during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And after a brief dip, the Dow and the NASDAQ surged. I mean, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is about 33% higher than it was before the pandemic. Not, I want to emphasize, not 33% higher than it was after the pandemic, after the stock market dipped. Mm. It dipped in March of 2020, and by June, it had regained all its value, and then it exploded. Yeah. But at the same time, Connecticut, at the worst of the pandemic, for example, lost 292,000 jobs. Mm-hmm. Here's some comparison. We lost about 120,000 jobs in the Great Recession. That was the recession of 2007 to 2009. Yeah. 120,000 versus 292. It took us a decade to regain about 90 of those 120,000 jobs. And that's all we regained when the pandemic struck. Yeah,
we weren't all the way back to where we were before that when this whole...
And by the way, we're still not all the way back from forget the pre-Great Recession. We're not back from the 292 we lost in the pandemic. We still have about 60,000 jobs to go. Mm-hmm. We had, before the pandemic struck, an unemployment rate between 4 and 5%. But in some of our most impoverished urban areas, unemployment was between 13 and 14%.
Before?
You say, well, then how come the state revenues didn't plunge? Well, here's another thing. We've never in modern history had a period of time where people were making significantly more money unemployed than they were employed. Mm. Think about the jobs that were lost during the pandemic. A lot of them were service jobs, restaurant jobs, lower paying jobs.
Minimum wage are close to,
Right. The average unemployment benefit's $300 a week. The federal government, and I'm not saying this was a bad thing, gave that $300 plus up. So all of a sudden, somebody employed is not getting $300 a week, but $600. Mm. Okay, $600 a week is the equivalent of making $31,000 a year. So somebody who was a busboy who lost, a job, all of a sudden is making more money unemployed. Yeah. Well, guess what? Most of that money is also taxable, Matt. Mm. So the state's income tax receipts don't go down. Why? Well, we get our income tax receipts, 2/3 of them from paycheck withholding. Mm-hmm. Well, these people weren't getting a paycheck, but they were getting unemployment benefits that were taxable. So the money kept coming into the state's coffers. The other 1/3 came from Wall Street. It's from quarterly returns that were filed regarding capital gains or dividends. Mm. Those didn't just hold firm. Those exploded.
Yeah.
So the temptation is if state government's fine, the economy must be fine, right? Well, we really don't know. The federal plus-up money for the unemployed just went away in September.
Yeah, so that's going away. That's not a permanent addition to the income tax.
I'll finish my rant just saying we've been on really, really good economic Novocaine, and it's just beginning to wear off. And now we're going to kind of feel what kind of dental surgery we've been going through over the last
it's been kind of masking the real pain that we're going to eventually take from this hit. It's pushed it down line, and probably a good thing that it did. Getting through the worst of this pandemic, we needed that to keep people, ideally some people should not have gone to work and should have stayed home and taken that money. But yeah, it's not a permanent situation where we're going to have this
You
extra
don't
money.
feel the pain of the surgery until the painkiller wears off.
Yeah. I mean, kind of related to this, some people have been saying, look at this great budget surplus, using it as justification for some things. In the Hearst papers, former House Republican leader Themis Clarities wrote that, in fact, Connecticut is not headed in the right direction with the overreliance on sales of property taxes to fund programs at the town and state level. Does the surplus seem to suggest that we're taxing too much, not enough?
Those are almost two issues, and I'll try to break those down. And I feel guilty, but I want to say, I guess I'm going to blame CCM. Your questions are all in my wheelhouse, but they're all forcing me to give my negative answers. So if I get accused of gloom and doom, it's all CCM.
It's all on us.
I got to give you some perspective here, Matt. We've got about roughly a $22 billion state budget, and we have about $3 billion in our rainy day fund or emergency reserve, whatever you call it. It's roughly enough to cover 15% of annual operating costs. That's the legal max. And it's great to have $3 billion in the bank. It's great that in addition to that, we've had over $1 billion in extra payments, about $1.5 billion into our pension funds because the rainy day fund's full. But set against that $3 billion in the rainy day fund, set against that extra $1.5 billion we put in the pension funds, are more than $90 billion in unfunded liabilities. In other words, long-term bonded debt and pension debt that we've built up since 1939.
Yeah, this is not new stuff. Yeah.
We have a tough road to hoe through at least the 2040s or the 2050s. And everything is relative, meaning this is what right now, because of the stock market, is the new normal's version of boom times. Taxes didn't go down, they just didn't go up. If the stock market plunges, everybody will stop talking about things. I mean, in relative terms, Connecticut did damage to its finances. We can go into that if you want. For the better part of 7 decades, state government's finances. You don't crawl out of that by having 2 great years in the stock market. So that to me answers the question of, do we tax too much or too little? It's not about, is it smart to raise taxes because taxes are dragging the economy? Of course you don't want to have a drag in your economy. But when you owe so much money that your bills are growing faster than your economy can, I hate to use this expression, but it's called welcome to the world if you don't have a choice. When the bill is at the door, you are forced to do things that hurt your economy because you have the wealth and the ability to pay. So you can't go to a judge and say, Your Honor, we can't pay or it'll weaken our economy. Judge will say, well, you shouldn't have gotten into that much trouble.
Yeah.
As far as, do we over-rely, though, on property taxes too much? I think the math would absolutely say yes, because we rely way too much on taxes that are not affected by or conditional upon a household's ability to pay. In other words, they're regressive taxes.
Yeah, regressive taxes.
Sales tax for the state government and property tax for municipal governments. But we collect twice as much collectively in property taxes as we do in income taxes throughout the state of Connecticut. That disproportionately burdens low and middle income households, that perpetuates some of the most extreme wealth inequality on planet Earth is in Connecticut. I mean, we have studies that show effectively, if you're a household making less than $50,000 a year, about 25% of your earnings effectively go to state and local property taxes. If you're making a couple $1 million a year, it's closer to maybe 7%.
Yeah, because everyone has a house, everyone lives somewhere, but not everyone has stock portfolios and millions sitting in the bank that could be taxed through income tax or things like that. And
absolutely.
Yeah, because I mean, Connecticut historically was one of the most expensive states to live in with taxes, and we were also historically, and still are, one of the highest earning states. So there's not a shortage of money either coming in or going in.
No, that's sort of the myth. Some people will say, well, people are, I know this is controversial, but people like to say, well, there's this huge outpouring of wealth leaving the state of Connecticut. I'm sorry that the empirical data does not back that up. And the other problem is you can't go before a federal judge and say, well, we shouldn't have to pay our pension bills because we won't be the wealthiest state and the wealthiest nation in the world if we do. We might only be the 10th wealthiest state, and we've always really enjoyed being number one, Your Honor. So can we default on our obligations? I'm not talking about what's morally right or wrong. I'm simply saying legally, no federal judge is going to say that. They're going to say, listen, you're not Puerto Rico, you're not Arkansas, you're not even Michigan.
You've got the money.
Back home, Connecticut, pay your bills, and then don't create those problems in the future.
Yeah.
That's unfortunately where we are and where we'll be for quite a while.
Yeah. Some of the expense and the kind of regressive nature of some of this, you've looked at income tax equity throughout your career. Is there a fair way to tax that will benefit everyone? Or is the state always going to be picking some winners and losers?
Connecticut and every state will always have the challenge of what's fair. There's always, difference of opinion among people of what is fair. What I think Connecticut does have to be concerned about, though, is when you have a significant segment of your population that is not significantly contributing to the gross state product. In other words, they're not very productive. That's always a form of economic instability. Some people don't think of it in these terms, but Connecticut Voices for Children did an interesting analysis on this. That's a policy group out of New Haven. Simply said, are we risking the long-term health of the state's economy by having so many households living paycheck to paycheck? And that's before the pandemic.
Yeah.
That's why I'm very curious to see where does Connecticut's economy go over the next couple of years when the federal stimulus goes away.
Yeah.
I do think that's the real question is the tax system fair enough to keep the economy healthy? And at some point, if the wealth inequality is so great, ultimately, does the entire state suffer from it?
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM.
This kind of rolls into another conversation that CCM always likes to talk about, and that's PILOT, or the Payment in Lieu of Taxes program. Recently, they tried to make the formula a little bit more equitable, but it's also never been fully funded. What's your take on the situation? Do you think that there will ever be a time when that program does become fully funded?
I'm trying so hard to stay out of the cynical pool, Matt, and you just keep pulling me back. I have a feeling that we'll see if people get the movie reference. Charlton Heston will be on a horse approaching the Statue of Liberty, and apes will be running the planet before we ever get PILOT all the way back to where it is. I told that joke. I was talking to a group of college students, and they just looked at me like they didn't know what I was saying. And I said, Planet of the Apes, 1968. And I was like, I just
Mark
Wahlberg. I wanted to shake a cane and say, kids, get off my lawn. The problem is, and again, I should clarify for the listeners, like you said, PILOT is payment in lieu of taxes. And it's one of the major non-education grants or grant programs that the state has. It reimburses municipalities for certain types of property that they can't tax, that are property tax exempt.
State-owned hospitals,
state-owned land,
colleges,
land owned by nonprofit colleges and hospitals. And that can be very significant, particularly in our urban centers.
Yeah, Hartford is full of state buildings.
Exactly. This is a huge drain. And to give people some idea, on paper, there are reimbursement rates, but in actuality, I'd have to double check the exact numbers, but approximately we're reimbursing for state property on something like, I think it's like 15 cents on a dollar, and for education property, it might be like 27 cents, but these are very small, reimbursement rates. And the problem, this goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast, because we've owed so much pension debt for so long, and because over the last 20 years, it's particularly become burdensome because when you put off your pension debt, you hear the acronym, you're kicking the can down the road, but you're not. Yeah. You're rolling a snowball. Your problem gets bigger because of interest over time. Yeah. Every time you don't put money into the pension fund, you don't just forfeit the money you didn't put in, but you forfeit all the investment earnings it would have made. And over 30, 40 years, it's the earnings on the earnings on the earnings that we count on. And because we've forfeited billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars of potentially free money, interest earnings over these decades, we've leached resources out of everything else. We've had a tough time maintaining aid programs to cities and towns. It's been this back and forth situation where we promise aid to towns. We either don't deliver it at all, or we deliver it for a few years. The economy goes bad, the stock market dips, our coffers aren't as full, and we retreat on it. And there's been a lot more retreats than advances over the last 20 years when it comes to municipal aid. So even though right now the state's coffers have been growing and we've seen our first increase in significant non-education aid in a while, we are still providing less non-education aid to municipalities than we were 20 years ago. And that's even before I adjust for inflation. The math would suggest, given all that we owe and the way the markets go up and down, pilot will probably get worse before it ever gets all the way. I just couldn't see anything where we fund even close to 100% anytime soon.
Which is not a great situation because, we're talking about before, helping out the people on unemployment, that the lowest common denominator people play into that whole thing. It's all connected. And
in the short term, it's good.
The hospitals, the whatever in these cities are used by the entire area. They're not just Hartford. Right. It's not just New Haven. So the surrounding area comes to, Yale, New Haven, whatever. They're benefiting the community, but it's New Haven or Hartford that's kind of losing that tax base.
And at some point, the state is going to have to look on picking up some of those expenses, helping municipalities bear those burdens in some other way. And that's going to eventually involve the state income tax. But politically, nobody's ready to have that discussion now.
One discussion that we are trying to have right now, kind of about the state helping out the towns. We recently kind of started a coalition with some other state groups, asking the state to help out with HVAC repairs in schools. You recently quoted Konstantinos Diamantis, who oversees the state school construction program for the last 6 years. And he said, there are some districts that haven't touched their schools in 40 years. The local level needs to belly up to the bar. The cities have an obligation to maintain those buildings. What's your take on the HVAC situation?
Now this is one where I think I can kind of argue both sides. And yes, your quote is accurate from the governor's deputy budget director, and he's also the person who oversees the school construction program. We should point out again for the listeners, the state can help municipalities cover school construction costs anywhere from like 20 to 70, 80% of the cost, depending on a community's wealth. The state will reimburse them for it, but not everything. It mostly does what you and I would call major projects, new construction or a major renovation. If you are just doing, say, just a very small project, it depends. If you're working, for example, on a roof, the state's had this history of like, okay, well, we'll help you. You're just doing a roof project on your elementary school, we'll help you. Oh, you're doing an HVAC, you're doing new heating, ventilation, air conditioning. No, that's a local responsibility. And yes, it's true that cities and towns, and for that matter, state government, have long been deferring maintenance. That's usually the first thing to go. The last thing you want to do, any municipality wants to do, is lay off teachers. If the money is tight, they want to keep the programs funded, and the maintenance suffers. That's the formula for any municipality. And quite frankly, that's been the formula for state government. So you can say, have cities and towns put all the money they wanted into HVACs? No. By the same token, has the state put all the money it's pledged to or wanted to into cities and towns? We've just established.
Back to pilot, if they're not getting that money, where are they coming up with other money to upgrade the HVAC?
Into your discussion, along comes COVID. And all of a sudden, air quality is far more important than
it's not just that, someone's there's mold in there and they've got a cough,
right.
or their asthma, or towards the end of the year there has been a lot of things where people have to shut down the school because it's just too hot because there's no air conditioning.
And
but now we've brought in this extra element of bad air quality can literally mean life or death in some situations.
And we're also rolling now, Matt, into a gubernatorial election year. The legislature has already reacted to DeMontis's comments. Some legislative leaders have said, well, we can't take a hard line with cities and towns. We'll have to have a discussion in the 2022 General Assembly session about what we can do. Maybe we can't pick up all the bills, but where can we find some middle ground? I think as Governor Lamont campaigns for re-election, and although he hasn't formally announced, it's probably the worst kept secret at the Capitol. I think everyone certainly expects him to run. I can tell you he's budgeting like somebody who's running for re-election. I think he's going to face a lot of pressure. He wants to campaign on how he has managed pandemic, how he's helped Connecticut get through that period. And I think that's going to be a very sensitive area. Yeah. And I think that it's not going to be just municipalities and parent-teacher groups who hold his feet to the fire on air quality in our schools. Yeah. It's not a simple issue, and you can't just brush it aside.
Yeah. Although I will have to say that, looking at how he has handled the pandemic so far, the rates right now in Connecticut are some of the lowest in the country. So
true.
On some level, something seems to have been working right.
I think the administration considers that a big strength. I'm not trying to take a side on the issue, but the fact of the matter is that the data absolutely is in Governor Lamont's favor. I mean, Connecticut has had some of the lowest infection rates. Yeah. But the pandemic has brought out problems people didn't anticipate. Air quality in schools is one of them, but it's not going to go away anytime soon either.
Yeah, and one of the ways we've gotten as a state to this, nationwide better rate than a lot of other places is by making smart choices, and maybe dealing with this HVAC is another one of those smart choices that Connecticut needs to make for our own good, definitely. So kind of moving on to another issue that kind of crosses budgetary and some personal interest lines. Local governments have grappled with marijuana being sold in their municipalities. Some have argued that the taxes they receive isn't enough to justify selling a product that's still illegal at the federal level. What's your thoughts on this issue? Will some towns not selling help tax receipts in other towns that do? Is it going to be a net, plus for the state monetarily?
I think to a certain extent, marijuana is unknown. I'm not trying to duck the question. I think the biggest thing I can give you on the marijuana, though, is perspective. It is simply not the huge cash cow some people believe it is. It's tough sometimes in my job. I got to be careful because I've seen estimates that marijuana sales could ultimately net. Some people have said as much as $120 million a year. And I'm going to sit here, Matt, and I'm going to say, $120 million. Yeah. That's chump change. $120 million. And I'm describing it as nothing. I shouldn't say nothing, but I want to give you some perspective. The general fund, it pays for about 90% of the state budget. Another way to describe, by the way, what they're talking about marijuana bringing in now for the state and municipalities combined is maybe about $50 million a year. Another way to describe $50 million is 1/4 of 1% of the general fund, which is 9/10 of the state budget. Think about that one for a minute. 1/4 of 1% of the general fund.
Yeah.
You wouldn't turn the money down. It is not going to alter Connecticut fiscally one way or another. I also think that I expect as we enter a gubernatorial year, Governor Lamont and other candidates for state office are going to be facing more pressure than they normally do from anti-addiction forces to increase the amount of money the state does not that it spends on cessation and addiction treatment. The state does not have a good track record of using its tobacco settlement money. And 45 other states settled a huge lawsuit against the nation's 5 biggest tobacco manufacturers about 2 decades ago.
Yeah.
Connecticut got a huge annual settlement. the money basically is not used at all. I mean, the plan was never to use all of it to fight smoking, but we basically don't use any of it. It just goes into the budget.
Into the general fund and disappears.
Right. We rank as one of the worst states in the nation in terms of government investments in helping people kick smoking habit, helping to keep kids from starting to smoke. We still, as a legislature, they don't want to pass, for example, a ban on mentholated cigarettes. There's a real disconnect there because we still collect the revenue. And as we legalize more substances, there's going to be more pressure to say, well, if you do that, you can't do that and make money on it and not provide at least some services to help people who do become addicted or who struggle with addiction.
So the economic argument, while not totally, it's not wrong, there is money that would come in. It's not going to be some huge boon financially.
It's just not a game changer. It's not, I mean, you would not use, if you had a huge tree stump in your backyard, like enormous tree stump, and you couldn't have a picnic until you got rid of the tree stump. You wouldn't go out to the backyard with a penknife to attack that tree stump.
Yeah.
Not that a penknife is something bad. It's simply not the right tool for the job.
Yeah.
I don't even know if a chainsaw is, but you get my point. But there's a time when a penknife is very helpful. If you're carving an apple, that's what you want to use.
Yeah.
Marijuana is simply not a chainsaw, let's put it that way, when it comes to addressing the state's fiscal matters.
Yeah. And so the flip side of that, whether the morals, the whatever, whether it was right to be incarcerating people for, minor possession and stuff, that's a separate topic, but financially it's not some sort of huge windfall.
No, it's not. And it hasn't been for any state.
Yeah. So I'm assuming these estimates are in some part looking at Massachusetts, what's kind of played out up there and that sort of stuff. I know you were saying that the tax revenue is not much. Do those studies take into account anything like the courts or the police not spending time on some of those more minor cases? Is there any savings there?
No, it's not that. It's just, how can I describe it? Maybe I can compare it. Think about it again. If marijuana brings in $40 to $50 million to cities and towns and the state combined in 1 year, the income tax brings in almost $10 billion. It's just that
there's just not enough money there to really shift things in any way. Yeah.
Then I'm saying, what does that do? Does that does that increase the state's annual benefit for marijuana from 50 million to 52 million? And is that enough to push the needle in a $22 billion budget? Yeah. It can fund smaller programs. It does have advantages. I don't want to make it sound like you can't do anything with $50 million. But
the bigger win on the social justice side for some people's perspective than the financial.
We give almost $1.8 billion a year in education aid to cities and towns. $1.8 billion. They're just different scopes. That's all.
Oh, good to know. All of these issues we've been talking about, and then adding COVID on top has created a lot of unique situations in Connecticut politics, kind of on every level. You've written about government losing jobs, maybe not being such a bad thing. You've written about paying off pension debt, opioid settlements, vaccine mandates. What does the shape of the public perception of government at the state level, and how does that trickle down to our municipalities?
I'm glad you mentioned the lost jobs, because I know the article you're referring to, and I think the headline says, but is that a bad thing? And I'm not trying to imply it's a good thing. I'm saying I think it's very much up for debate. Both state government and municipal government downsized in terms of non-education employees during the past decade, during the 2010s. Most states actually downsized their public sector, but not as much as Connecticut. Connecticut really used that as one of the ways to deal with the fact that our economy was really struggling to recover.
From that great recession that we were talking about before, yeah.
Right. Now, just to give you an example, under Governor Malloy, who was governor from 2011 through 2018, the executive branch workforce in state government went down 10%. And it's not enough to just say, well, I thought state government was fat to begin with. You have agencies. I mean, state government's not homogenous. You have 60, 70 agencies. So you can have some that weren't in good staffing situations before that 10% contraction, like our prison system, like the Department of Transportation. We have in state government some areas where things are tight. And I'm sure the folks at CCM can tell you, if you go into just about any municipality outside of some of the most affluent in the state, and you ask them, how's the employment in the public works department? How is it in the police department? How is it in the fire department? I'm not saying it's in crisis, but I think just about any town could tell you, we could use some more people.
Yeah.
We've really already made things kind of tight in the public sector in that area. I know Governor Lamont really hopes to shrink state government's workforce more using technology to do that. There is, I mean, we see it in the private sector all over the place. I mean, someone my age can remember going into a supermarket when there was no such thing as an electronic teller. And now, you know, I mean, when
there was a cashier and a bag boy, and the bag boy might even take it out to your car for you.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, of course, that's just one example of jobs that are replaced with technology. Call centers now don't even really necessarily always feature human beings. They're just elaborate series of electronic recordings to stop you from ever talking to a human being. So the company doesn't have to pay an operator. Connecticut is doing that, downsizing, in the same way I said we took money from transportation, we took money from municipal aid, we took money from education, so we could pay our pension debt without having to raise the income tax as much as we already have. Well, this
so again,
is just
kicking that can, and another way to kick that can.
Right, that pension debt, that long-term debt that we ran, but we amassed between the late 2030s and 2010, I called it the magnet by our pension compass, by our budget compass, pulling us off course. It still puts so much pressure on state finances. We are always looking for an option to pay off that pension debt without raising the income tax.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to continue to see pressure on state government to downsize. The question is going to come down to is government really becoming more efficient? And if it's not, where does the public draw a line? Where do they say services are not being provided? I mean, we're privatizing more and more social services than ever before. But we've been for the large part trimming the margins. We're not really giving the private nonprofit sector that delivers the bulk of state-sponsored social services extra money to do it.
Yeah, privatization, we also talk a lot over CCM, you know, regionalization is one that comes up, you know.
Sure.
Because we have so many smaller towns, like some of them banding together to do things as a group. When you talk about the workforces being cut 10%, whatever, over the years, generally, does it work out on the savings as well? Is it saving 10%? Is it an efficient way to save that money?
We have reduced, I would have to get the number for you. We have reduced general fund payroll. The reason it does not shrink as quickly as the staffing is because, unfortunately, and I said these agencies aren't homogenous, you get some agencies where you didn't have enough staff to begin with. And we like to think that government is very efficient, and they go in and say, well, we look at each agency. This one should have more people. Most of these can get by with less. It doesn't work that way. You just sort of trim across the board and hope you didn't do too much damage. So where I'm going with this is, as we cut staffing in agencies that couldn't spare them, we ran up massive overtime bills. And overtime remains a big problem in state government.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean overall payroll is not going down. It has, but it eats up, it mitigates some of that savings.
And you're getting less done for the same amount of money because you're paying those people overtime to do that rather than the regular rate. Yeah.
No, I mean, and state government, and I don't just mean Connecticut, any state, it's never going to be a model in efficiency. That's not how government works. People say, well, why can't government be run by a business? It's not a business. It has all type of obligations that the private sector doesn't have.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about, we're coming into an election cycle here. What do you think in going to the election cycle? Do you feel like we're going to a shakeup, or forward, will the, good COVID numbers and that sort of part of Lamont's record keep him, in office in the land of steady habits?
Yeah, well, keep in mind, you're talking to someone who bets on the Red Sox every year. So although right now, I should say, I'm not looking too far ahead. The Red Sox are doing well in the playoffs so far. But all joking aside, of course, I'm not gonna call the next gubernatorial race, but I will say that one thing that supports Governor Lamont is that because of the state government's good fiscal fortune, I'm not saying the Connecticut economies, I'm saying state governments, he has not had to have any major tax increases. I'm not going to say there's been no tax increases, but there's been nothing major. Look, we've been able to stay away from the income tax. He's largely been able to, not entirely, largely been able to stay away from the sales tax. We never ended up doing tolls, which I'm not talking about whether we should or shouldn't. I'm simply saying I don't think
it's definitely a hot button issue. Yeah,
right. It's a hot button issue. They're not popular. So I think it's going to be the challenge, for the Republicans who want to unseat Governor Lamont to try to frame a different issue. I mean, they can, look, what Themis Claridis said about our long-term obligations is absolutely correct. And in the long run, and in fairness, that's not a problem Governor Lamont created. That's not a problem any one governor or legislature created. And both parties have their fingerprints all over that 70 or 80-year mess. But I think you're going to see the GOP sort of focus on his handling of COVID, and they're going to make, I think, some arguments that certain things should have been reopened faster. I don't know how well that's going to play in Connecticut.
Yeah, given the fact that we are one of the lowest rates in the country right now.
Right.
So we would say, we did that because it worked. It's
been largely a blue state. And certainly there was pain in the pandemic, and there's going to be pain no matter what. But I think it appears so far that that's where they're focusing a lot of their arguments.
I mean, it's certainly the issue of the day, as it were. Here's your opportunity to be a little less of the doom and gloom.
Okay.
If you're going to be called out to forecast, how is Connecticut going to be doing in 5 years? Will we still, have a rainy day fund? Is the infrastructure bill going to factor into the future? Where do you see us in 5 years?
Matt, this is so hard because, think about this. We had the last, really, really bearish of the bear markets. And I believe it was the spring of 2009.
Yeah.
When's the last time we've gone this long without, a significant contraction and lasting, a contraction that had lasting effect. The Dow's had some scary days.
Yeah.
Yet we've continued to bounce back. It's now been about 12 years, and I would have never guessed we would have gone 12 years. So to say 5 more, and unfortunately I'm still slipping into the gloom and doom. I'm thinking odds are we'll have a downturn before then, but I would have never guessed we would have gone this long.
Yeah.
So, I do think you're going to continue to see a renewed focus in the legislature on at least not adding to the pile of pension bills. That's something that did change under Governor Malloy. We're still not perfect. Believe it or not, when it comes to retirement health care, we still don't properly save for the benefits we're promising present-day employees. We save most of the money so that when those employees retire, the money to pay for the benefit we promise them while they're on the job is there. But we still also mail a bill to our children and grandchildren asking them to pick up the rest, which is what other generations did to us. Yeah. They hired teachers, they hired state employees, promised them pensions, but didn't set aside the money and left the next generations.
We'll get to that some other time, and they never did. Yeah.
Yeah. And, but even with that, we've got so much pressure that we're under, it can turn really fast. So if it does take a downturn, now I'm going to make $3 billion, which is what we have in the rainy day fund. Seems small. We could tear through that in I would say less than 2 years if we really had a bad economic downturn.
So like stock market goes down or whatever,
right, exactly.
Investments as a state aren't performing, that could all disappear pretty quick.
And that, to me, it's going to depend on how the national economy does, and so much of how we can get people working again. That's, again, we're still on the Novocaine. We still have fewer people employed now than we did in 2008.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Yeah. Especially as those unemployment checks start disappearing, right, so on and so forth. Yeah.
We borrowed, or will have borrowed by the end of this year, about $1 billion from the federal government to keep our state unemployment benefits solvent.
Yeah. That
money has to be repaid. That's largely going to come from Connecticut businesses.
Yeah.
That's a huge bill they're going to have to handle, and that's going to take a toll on employment. I think it's going to be something we're going to be working through. I'm not convinced things are going to be better in 5 years.
Yeah. Now, you said, having to borrow money to pay that stuff for the unemployment, is that something that's been going on in other states as well, or is that kind of unique to Connecticut?
Yes, there is, and I don't want to make it sound like that was mismanagement in Connecticut. That's a good question.
It's just the reality of dealing with a pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah.
In almost any recession, states exhaust their unemployment trusts. This was a pretty big amount of borrowing, but we had to do. But I'm just saying it's just like cleaning up after a bad storm and you got some trees down in your backyard. That doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, it's quite an undertaking. Well, this was a really bad storm.
Yeah.
We didn't notice it because the federal government came in there with all this additional money for households. But as that money goes away, we're going to start feeling the pain.
Yeah, we're not going to have that American Rescue Plan money. We're not going to have the other stuff, and we're still going to have those bills to pay eventually.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, it's not all doom and gloom, but there's certainly a lot of stuff to work on. That's for sure. Keith, thanks so much for speaking with us today.
It was great.
There's a lot of stuff to look at, and thank goodness you're out there looking into it all for us. So I hope everyone reads your stuff and stays abreast on what's going on, because an informed public is a good thing.
Thanks for having me. If anybody has time to go to ctmirror.org, it's a free website. Please check us out.
We agree. Thanks so much, Keith.
Thank you.
We'd like to thank our guest, Keith Phaneuf. We'd like to thank our premier sponsor, Digital Back Office, Palo Alto Networks, who you can check out at digitalbackoffice.com and paloaltonetworks.com. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Larry Draws is on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.